presented by Coppin State University. On this morning, I have the privilege of introducing Charles Ross, CEO of NBIA. So without further ado, I'm going to get started. Mr. Charles Ross, the CEO of NBIA, has had over 15 years of experience serving and working for communities in various shapes and sizes to build sustainable communities and entrepreneurial economic systems. His experience spans across several innovative related principles that include entrepreneurship, business incubation, economic development, and investment management. He has provided strategic leadership for organizations that include private, nonprofit, and public domains that have directly mentored the coaches and founders of these organizations. And this includes some of the top 30 high growth countries across the nation. Before joining NBIA's management team, Mr. Ross was responsible for driving economic impact for local communities through senior leadership positions at Kennesaw State University and Georgia Institute of Technology. Prior to his assignment in higher education, Mr. Ross directly worked for entrepreneurs to launch and grow technology businesses as Vice President of Telecommunications Development Funds and as Director of Ameritech Venture Capital Division. Mr. Ross joins NBIA in 2006 and was elected to the board of directors in 2011. He has served as chair in 2017 and currently holds an undergraduate degree in electrical engineering from Marquette University and an MBA from Indiana University. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce Mr. Charles Ross.
Good morning, and Sharita, thanks so much for that great introduction. It is definitely an honor to be able to kick off this year's conference on the topic of economic inclusion. I'm so much looking forward to sharing my thoughts and perspectives on this topic. I'd like to thank Dr. Williams and the Center for Strategic Entrepreneurship for the invitation to speak. I am so pleased that Coppin State and the Center is a part of the NBIA community. NBIA stands for the International Business Innovation Association, and we're a network of entrepreneurship center professionals. And our job is to really connect those professionals to the people and resources that allow them to be successful. And it's been a pleasure to get to know the Center for Strategic Entrepreneurship better and some of its work, specifically the work around entrepreneurs. And given the needs in our communities across the U.S., this type of work in entrepreneurs has never been more important. And this topic that we have for today on economic inclusion, I think is also timely and relevant. So I'm really excited about the next few minutes speaking with all of you. And I'm excited because over my professional career, much of my adult life in that work has exposed me to not only the challenges of economic inclusion, but also the opportunities around economic inclusion. So as Sharita mentioned early in my career, through the venture capital work and interacting with the technology ecosystems across the U.S., I had a chance to see situations where there wasn't a lot of diversity and a lot of inclusion. Early in 2000, I had a chance to work with some of the major trailblazers in economic inclusion and worked on helping ecosystems in Atlanta and DC, New York to become a little bit more open and inclusive and diverse. And most recently, I've been working with entrepreneurship centers across the world and definitely with entrepreneurship centers within the United States towards this particular journey. So I'm going to want to share a couple of slides here, and hopefully the technology will work here for us. So my topic today is entrepreneurship centers, pathways to inclusion. And it is my hope that after our time today, I can leave each one of you with three major takeaways. Number one, that economic inclusion is key to America's continued prosperity, but especially in the context of entrepreneurship. Second takeaway is really talk about entrepreneurship centers and the role that they can play in helping our American economy become more prosperous and inclusive. And then third, I want to talk about universities and why they are really well positioned to launch and sustain entrepreneurship centers. So let's start with the first takeaway: economic inclusion, key to continued prosperity, but in the context of entrepreneurship. So why the qualifier? And I think the first message that I want to share is the linkage between entrepreneurship and prosperity. Here's a definition that I love. There's so many definitions of entrepreneurship, but I love this definition. Entrepreneurship, the pursuit of opportunity without regard to resources currently controlled. Pursuit of opportunity without regard to resources currently controlled. And what's so powerful about not only the process of entrepreneurship are the outcomes. So the outcomes that include enabling new and disruptive technologies, creating new industries, creating opportunities for wealth creation, and creating new businesses. And in the US, the link between entrepreneurship and prosperity has been demonstrated through research. And research has demonstrated that business startups, new businesses, are disproportionately responsible for the innovations that drive economic growth. That also leads to virtually all net new job creation. So this explains the connection between entrepreneurship and prosperity. But what about economic inclusion? So to get a better feel for how economic inclusion comes into play, let's take a look at the context of entrepreneurship and examine the trends of prosperity that we've seen in the United States over the past several years. So this slide here takes a look at the 10-year moving average of gross GDP, gross domestic product. And simply speaking, it is looking at the growth rate of GDP. And simply speaking, improving growth rates, more growth makes life better. And if we look at this last 10 years, we'll see that for most of the period, our GDP has been in the range of 2 to 5%, probably more narrowly in the 3 to 4%. But recently, that growth has gone below 2%. And when you look at GDP, every percent really matters. So, for example, if you look at a 1% growth rate, you will look at a country's standard of living at that growth rate doubling every 70 years. If you look at 2% growth rate, then that doubling happens in 35 years. And if you're fortunate to be at a 7% growth rate, you're doubling your standard of life, quality of life every 10 years. So this is what we've experienced in terms of prosperity, the trends of prosperity in the United States. And remember, we talked about the linkage between entrepreneurship and prosperity. So what's been the trend of entrepreneurship? And so if you look at this particular slide here, the source here is from the Congressional Budget Office, and it takes a look at, pay attention to, I guess, the black or the blue line, which is really a proxy for the rate of entrepreneurship, firms entering the market. And you look at the numbers, it's no surprise that entrepreneurship in America is in trouble. A few years ago, kind of early 2000, this rate had dipped to a 40-year low. And what's even more alarming is that there's other research that shows that this decrease in the rate of entrepreneurship has been pervasive throughout the United States, in just about every state, in over 300 or so metro areas, and it's happening across major industries. Then in addition to that, so not only are we starting fewer businesses, there was additional research that came out in 2019 that said that in ecosystems across 32 states, that the ecosystems themselves are doing a worse job in scaling companies in a meaningful and systemic way. So clearly, this is alarming, and firms like organizations like the NBIA and the Kauffman Foundation over past several years have been very concerned in exploring how can we increase America's entrepreneurial capacity. And the solutions have been in a couple of buckets. Solutions have been in the bucket of access to capital, access to network, know-how, removing regulatory red tape. But there's been a lot of effort around specifically how can we break down the barriers to allow all entrepreneurs to pursue entrepreneurship regardless of their race, their gender, and their geography. And key to this work is around economic inclusion. So recently, NBIA completed a playbook on improving diversity, inclusion, and entrepreneurship centers. And in this playbook, we draw attention to several of the factors that depress outcomes for entrepreneurs of color. A couple of main factors that we draw attention to in this playbook is around the wealth gap and also around challenges to access to capital. So you take a look at the wealth gap. The wealth gap really makes it difficult for entrepreneurs of color to effectively leverage personal resources and family resources to launch their venture. So you take a look at this survey out of 2019 from the Survey of Consumer Finances and comparing the median net worth of white families with non-white families and households from other racial groups. And you'll see that difference varies from as high as 2.5 times to 8 times a difference in the wealth gap. So that's significant. And so if the family resources and personal resources are not there for entrepreneurs of color, clearly we can go out to independent investors to help fuel new ventures. But as you see in this infographic, in the scenario that I think is fairly well known, is that entrepreneurs of color really struggle with private capital to fuel their ventures. So the playbook that we have provided really makes the case that increasing these outcomes for entrepreneurs of color is really an economic imperative for the United States. And there's really a sense of urgency around that imperative. You look here at this slide from the Kauffman Foundation and looks at what the share of entrepreneurs by race. And we see over the past period of years here that the percentage of white entrepreneurs has declined. And for many of our other racial groups, that percentage has remained relatively flat. And then what's even more telling are some of these demographic projections around how the face of America will be changing. And by 2050, 2055, we won't have a single racial or ethnic majority here in the United States. So to recap, in order to grow prosperity in the United States, we need to unleash the power of entrepreneurship for all Americans. We're looking to unleash that through economic inclusion. And in doing this, we'll increase the rate of new business formation, which will drive economic growth, job creation, and then better quality of life for all of our participants in American society. So let me move to my second takeaway, that entrepreneurship centers can play an important role in enabling prosperous economies. So at NBIA, we use the word of entrepreneurship centers really to describe entrepreneurial support organizations that are employing or deploying a variety of models to assist entrepreneurs. The major categories of these models are usually in 3 areas around incubation, acceleration, and co-working. But as you can see in this slide, and I'm sure in everyone's personal experience, there are a variety of different terms to describe the ways in which organizations are providing support to entrepreneurs. What's key about the way in which we're doing this is that entrepreneurs are at the center of all of our activities, that these models are being done in a community-centric way, and that the programs and organizations themselves are fine examples of dynamic and sustainable entities. What's really exciting about entrepreneurship centers is a couple of different attributes. One, entrepreneurship centers are effective in reducing the risk of new business formation. They are a very low-cost option to create jobs in communities, and they are broadly applicable across communities. Many of the models that in the research that's been done on entrepreneurship centers and incubators show that the success rate of incubators and the survival rate of companies that go through incubators range in the 68% to 87% range. And this compares very favorably when you look at just overall success rates for many new businesses or failure rates that often can exceed 50% 5 years into the tenure of a new venture. Cost effectiveness in terms of these entrepreneurship centers. Typically, if you look at return on investments of public funds into entrepreneurship centers, it's not uncommon for a return of capital, and in some cases, multiple return of public investment. And then lastly, I'm so excited about these entrepreneurship center models being able to work across communities. We think there's about 9,000 or so entrepreneurship centers, and that just about any community can leverage entrepreneurship centers to grow and create new businesses. So for several years, NBIA has been helping its members through a journey towards greater diversity and inclusion. And Verna Myers is a leading diversity and inclusion expert, and she uses this metaphor of a party to describe this journey. So initially, we have talked about how can we make our centers more diverse. And this was akin to, in the metaphor of an attending or extending an invitation to entrepreneurs of color to attend the party. Next, we talked about being more inclusive, and continuing with the metaphor is actually encouraging our guests at the party to not only attend the party, but actually dance. And now much of the discussion in our community is around how do we move beyond diversity and how do we move beyond inclusion and focus on creating a sense of belonging, extending the metaphor, which is not only coming to the party, dancing at the party, but then also providing your input on the music that's going to be played. But unlike this simple metaphor, in our industry, the progress of becoming more diverse and inclusive hasn't been as linear. So we've been focusing on this for probably about the past 4 or 5 years, and it started off with a series of very uncomfortable conversations in our community. Over time, those conversations have been more informed and more progressive, and we are moving towards those conversations from conversations to moving towards action. And so in this playbook that I'm sharing, it was funded by support from JP Morgan and Chase, and it's one of 3 playbooks that JP Morgan sponsored to really increase entrepreneurship in more faces, or for more faces and in more places. And through this playbook, we took a look at the practices of over 30 organizations in 3 key areas: engagement and education, programming and culture, and growth and sustainability. On the engagement and education side, we're really looking at what are some of the strategies to encourage entrepreneurs of color or people of color to see entrepreneurship as a viable option. Really looking at strategies around how do you connect with people and entrepreneurs of color? How do you leverage your influence in your particular ecosystem and work with other ecosystem players? What I find is very enlightening in thinking about the engagement and education opportunity around increasing diversity, inclusion, and entrepreneurship centers is this particular economic development pyramid that was authored by Rodney Sampson of the Opportunity Hub. And Rodney talks about this series of levels that starts at the bottom with just exposure and socialization around entrepreneurship, all the way up to the top where we get to the ultimate wealth creation and job creation. And what's key and what we found and highlighted in this playbook is that many ecosystems start really at the intersection of talent and innovation, or that transom. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done before that around really building the pipeline of entrepreneurs of color. And this playbook highlights ways in which thought leaders are really playing a role in building the pipeline. The other area is around programming and culture. And this is really around looking at how do you make sure your programs and how your space is designed is really creating an environment where entrepreneurs of color feel welcome. And in this particular section in the playbook, we have a case study that we share. It's very interesting. It's an organization called E4All, and this is for all in Spanish. I'm not going to try to pronounce it in Spanish, but it talks about how they were entering in a new geography in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and geography, a community is about 70% Latino. And for the rollout of their initial program, a pitch competition, on the first day of the competition, they found that there was not one participant that had a Latino descent. They went back and looked at, kind of did a debrief on how they marketed the program and found out that they only marketed the program online and it was only marketed in English. Their solution was to partner with other organizations to reach their target demographic, looking at how they can hire staff from the community to build trust, and lo and behold, delivering their program and their outreach in Spanish helped. Third area in the playbook is around growth and sustainability. And this is really around once we have these ventures that are led by entrepreneurs of color started and launched, how do we grow them? And the practices here talks about connecting entrepreneurs to talent, connecting them to sources of capital, connecting them to customers. And the case study in the playbook here, which is so interesting, is the Business Growth Collaborative in Cleveland, Ohio. And this is a collaborative of 11 nonprofits that are working together to support startups in Cleveland. And the problem that they're addressing is really the problem that many entrepreneurs face, which is, hey, there are a lot of resources that are available in my community, but I might not be aware of all of them, or I'm just overwhelmed because there's so many of them. And then in some cases, many of our entrepreneurs of color are dealing with service provider fatigue, where they just don't see themselves as part of the target market for entrepreneurial support organization. So these 11 players in Cleveland, they work together. They meet regularly to discuss the needs of individual companies. They share a CRM, and they use a common protocols to track and deliver services. The result of this is each organization is able to focus on what they do well. They build trust between the entrepreneurial support organization and entrepreneurs, and it's one-stop shopping for entrepreneurs. Lastly, I understand that many of our attendees at this conference are connected to academia in some way, and I would be remiss if I didn't make the case that universities are uniquely positioned to launch and sustain entrepreneurship centers. Recently, NBIA conducted a survey of its community and found that about 33% of its members are affiliated with universities in some kind of way. And if you think about just the diversity of universities and just the rich programming that they typically provide in a community, it's not surprising that universities form excellent anchors for entrepreneurship centers. Here's a framework that was jointly developed by the University Economic Development Association and APLU. And it really takes a look at three basic mechanisms that universities can use to bring value to local economies and to communities: talent, innovation, and place. And we use this particular framework in a course that we provide, NBIA provides, called Building Successful University Entrepreneurship Centers. And in using this framework, we ask our participants to map all of the different programs that their university provides in these various spheres, and then also at the intersection of these spheres. And it becomes very obvious when you do that kind of work of all of the assets that universities bring to the work of entrepreneurship centers. For me, the top assets that entrepreneurship or that universities brings, number one, is just in the breadth and the depth of the knowledge that is created and disseminated in universities. It really allows universities to be knowledge hubs. Second, I think the long-term horizon that university brings brings stability, and it brings continuity to many of these efforts that really need a time frame of decades in order to make significant impacts. And then universities are strong conveners, and so allows universities are able to be trusted brokers to bridge across public, private, and nonprofit sectors. And so for those of you who are looking to anchor entrepreneurship centers in your universities and learn a little bit more about how that can happen, I encourage you to attend an upcoming convening for NBIA. It's our International Conference on Business Incubation. It starts in about a week or so, April 26th to the 30th. It's going to be virtual, and it'll be covering 6 full tracks of content, everything from starting up a new entrepreneurship center to how do you navigate and pivot through the pandemic and into recovery. Okay, so it has been a pleasure to share my views and perspectives on universities and entrepreneurship centers as we look to improve prosperity across our communities here in the United States. Clearly, given the attributes of entrepreneurship centers, I believe that these programs and organizations are excellent tools and can play a major role in improving economic inclusion for entrepreneurs of color. As one of the largest networks of entrepreneurship centers, NBIA is committed to this journey, and we look forward to working with our members, and we look forward to working with other stakeholders as we help enable more entrepreneurial dreams throughout the United States. So I want to thank you for your time, and I look forward to addressing any questions in the chat. So I see that we have probably about 11 or so minutes that I reserved for Q&A. And are there any questions that you might have for me? And if so, I guess you can enter them into the chat widget that's to the right of your screen. One other thing that I will share is I will work with the conference organizers to make sure that our new playbook that we're launching is available to the participants. We're very proud of that. Great. Okay. So I think that if there are no further questions, it's been my pleasure to kick off the session on economic inclusion. I want to say that I think that this is just so important of a topic for entrepreneurial ecosystems across the United States. I hope that over the next 2 days, that the discussions that you will have will be thought-provoking and will stimulate discussions. And I want to wish the very best to each and every one of you, and to make myself available for any questions you may have about NBIA or entrepreneurship centers. Hopefully you receive my contact information. It's at imbia.org, where you can reach us on our website. And my email is cross@nbia.org. Have a great rest of the day and a great time for tomorrow.